Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Now What? Using Federal Aid for an Equitable Education Comeback. My name is Lynn Jennings, and I'm the Senior Director of National and State Partnerships at the Education Trust. Before we get started with today's webinar, I would like to give a little context for our discussion today. The federal government has passed 3 COVID relief packages. I'm sorry, I'm having tech difficulties. Sorry. The federal government has passed 3 COVID relief packages. Across these 3 packages, states have been allocated close to, if not a little more than, $200 billion to combat learning disruptions in schools and to address some of the trauma that has been experienced by some of our most vulnerable students and children. In today's webinar, the 2 simple questions that we'll be exploring are, number 1, what is happening to this money? And number 2, what should be happening with it? Especially if we want these funds to reach the students, schools, communities that have been most devastated by COVID. In our first session, we will learn how states are planning to use these funds and how they're using these funds to address unfinished instruction. Which states have promising practices and which do not, for making sure that students' learning is accelerated and we're not simply just playing a catch-up game. The second session, it will deal with the concern that many state leaders have expressed about what happens when federal funding runs out. This session will focus on how the federal funding cliff can be avoided, how to diagnose equity challenges, and how short-term funding can be and should be leveraged to increase equity in the long term. In our final session, our third session, we'll hear from the people, the advocates who are doing the work to make sure that equity grounds all federal funding plans. We can't afford to take our eye off the ball. Students and equity must remain front and center of all conversations about spending federal education relief dollars. Please hear me clearly. This is going to take work. Many will take for granted that this is simply happening, and it is not. It is not. So we have a lot to cover today, but I want to ask you to do one more thing before we get started. Ask you to do one thing before we get started. Throughout the day, we will share a survey, and we kindly ask that you fill it out. These surveys help guide our work moving forward. And as an incentive to do so, you may receive a $25 gift card. We will randomly select 4 survey completers throughout the day to receive a gift card. So now let's really get started. First, let me introduce Allison Sokol, our Assistant Director of P12 Policy, and Kayla Patrick, the Senior Policy Analyst on our P12 team. Allison, Kayla, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. We're so excited to talk to you today about how states are and should be, hopefully, fingers crossed, using federal funds to accelerate learning. So today, as Lynn so graciously introduced, Allison and I will be digging deep into what we can do to solve unfinished learning and some of the federal dollars we have allocated towards that. You'll hear from Allison later in the presentation, but just to think about, just so you all can see where we're going, I'm gonna give a brief overview of what unfinished learning is, and then we're gonna talk about how we can solve it through the research. I'm gonna talk about 3 different strategies, that is targeted intensive tutoring, extended learning, and building developmental relationships. And then I'm gonna hand it over to Allison, who's gonna talk about what we hope states will do. And we have an exciting activity for you all to really engage with some of the materials we're going to go over. And then we're going to talk about a few opportunities for advocacy at the end. So before I get us started, I just want to say that EdTrust uses the phrase unfinished learning instead of what you may have heard, learning loss, just so we can think about the assets that many kids bring to the classroom and not really focus on deficits. We don't think that those other terms really accurately portray what is happening. And so a few other terms you may hear from me and Allison is using acceleration instead of remediation. So we really think it's important to ground this conversation in acceleration, because the research says acceleration really does work to solve unfinished learning. So what is acceleration? Acceleration means that we can connect and blend unfinished learning, so the things that students may not have learned over the last year and some change that we were in this pandemic, while they are learning new content. So that doesn't mean that we remediate and give students things like worksheets over and over again. We're really trying to build on top of new content and make sure that they are able to fill any unfinished learning gaps that they may be experiencing. So that means that we integrate prior lessons when needed. And really, studies have found that acceleration really works, right? So it's effective for students of color, whereas other strategies like remediation, making students repeat the same content until they really master all of it. Studies have found that to be less effective and only effective under limited circumstances. And it really has negative effects on students of color and English learners. Some of those effects that have been studied are dropout, increased disciplinary issues, and long-term economic impacts that come with both of those things. So I want to ground us in real students, right? So we are not just talking about policy at a high level, but we're thinking about the many students who have been affected by this, by the school building closures and by lots of things that are happening in their real lives. So throughout this presentation, I want you to think about Maya. Maya lives with her mom, who is a nurse, her grandmother, her 12-year-old brother, and her 3-year-old sister. During this pandemic, she shared a computer with her brother for the first 4 months of the pandemic. Her school opted for 3 hours of Zoom class a day, so she really had only 3 hours of school mostly, but her neighborhood suffered from unstable internet on some days. So some days she couldn't even log on at all, and she missed that critical lesson on those days that she couldn't log on. To think about who Maya is as a person and not just who she is in the classroom. Maya is a natural caregiver. She always wants to help her mom and siblings in any way that she can. And she really is worried about being back in school buildings now that they're open. And Maya hasn't had any contact with her teachers during this pandemic. And so she is really concerned about not knowing the adults in the building as she returns. So Maya, because of many of those barriers that I just highlighted, like many other students, is experiencing unfinished learning. So I want to talk about what schools should be doing with some of that federal funding that they have. And this is really guided by research that the Education Trust did with MDRC. So the first strategy that I'm going to talk about is what we call targeted intensive tutoring. Sometimes that's better known as high dosage tutoring. And what that really is that one tutor works all over an extended period of time, like all year and every school day, on academic skills with students. The key equity considerations here are it must be a well-trained tutor. I can't emphasize that enough. It really needs to be a single tutor working with less than 4 students at a time. If you put a single tutor with more than 4 students, then they really aren't able to give students that targeted attention that they need to help them fill those unfinished learning gaps. It's really important that tutors aren't just giving homework help, right? They need to be working on a skill building curriculum that's closely aligned to what students are learning during the school day. This is how we can accelerate learning, right? So we build on top of the new content and we work to fill those gaps that may be existing from the last year and a half or the long-term inequities that we see in schools. And then we really want to target to students' academic needs. And in order to do that, we need to give students some kind of assessment and diagnostic to really understand where they are experiencing some of these unfinished learning gaps. And so in these briefs that we created with MDRC, and you can find them on our website, you will find these charts. And we really use these charts to think about the trade-offs, right? So some districts can use funds and really work and really use all their funds for the things on the left side of this chart. But some districts will have to make some kind of concessions and won't be able to use all the more effective strategies, but we really want to push schools and districts to use the more effective strategies whenever they can. And so we have made an easy to use chart here. And the more effective strategies are certified teachers. Certified teachers have the training and the knowledge to really hit the ground running with students as tutors. And like I said before, the student to teacher or tutor ratio must be relatively small. The skill building curriculum is really important. And it's really important that these tutors are well trained. And so we should be using some of our funds on training. And that includes pre-service and ongoing training, and also some coaching too, as tutors work with students along the year. They should get some observations and the like to really make sure that they are meeting those students' needs. What the research says works best is when tutoring is during the school day, when students are already in school buildings. In the best case scenario, sometimes this won't be possible, but the best case scenario of these tutors working with students for the entire school year and every day for around an hour. That's what's most effective according to the research. And at the end, I will say that the research shows that younger students are most affected by targeted intensive tutoring, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work for older students. That just really has to do with our youngest learners really having the brain capacity to really soak up a lot of knowledge. So to think about this, I want to take a sample program so we can kind of think about how much this will cost. So I'm going to talk about level of literacy intervention, national tutoring scale up, and this can be found on a website. I'm sorry, whoops. How do I do this? Whoops, okay, so I'm sorry. This can be found on a proventutoring.org, and they have a list of all the targeted intensive tutoring programs that are proven to be effective. And so what this program does is it uses teachers or teacher assistants or paraprofessionals. It pairs 3 students with 1 teacher, and it uses that skill building curriculum that I said was important. They really have that professional development. It's 30 minutes instead of an hour for 14 to 18 weeks. So that's not that full year that the research shows that is most effective, but it is frequent enough that kids are really getting that skill building curriculum. And it's for our youngest learners. And what we can see here is that we're using the tutoring comes from certified teachers, so we calculate their salaries into that. And really what we can see from this program is that the total cost per student is only $863. And that really gives us some kind of context of how much it will cost for us to deliver intensive targeted tutoring for our youngest learners. And just for some more context, Detroit is getting $3,000 per student for unfinished learning strategies, right? So they have more than enough money to cover a program like this one to really use it to help students to solve those unfinished learning gaps. And I know that's a lot of numbers, but we really want to get to the activity. So please ask questions if you have some. The next strategy that I'm going to talk about really quickly is expanded learning time. And so this encompasses programs or strategies that can really help students to really master that material in addition to the normal school day. So this can be after school, summer school, or in-school programs, which in-school programs are preferable for lots of reasons, but mostly because it's easier to get kids back into school buildings. The key equity considerations here are similar to tutoring. It must be aligned to the in-school curriculum. You have to target the extended learning time to those gaps that we identify in assessments, right? So wherever a student like Maya hasn't mastered long division, she should use that extended learning time to really work on those skills instead of just getting homework help. Again, the well-trained educators are really critical here. And then the small class sizes are also important. And I'm sure if you've heard us talk about this before, you've heard us say that additional time in school cannot be effective if we are not using the typical school day really, really well. And so we need to really make sure that we're using the normal school day to really get students the high quality content and instruction that they need, and not just building on more bad time. So here's this chart again, this handy chart. You'll see a lot of similarities here between the intensive targeted tutoring and expanded learning. So the only thing that I think is really critical to highlight again here is the small class sizes. Less than 15 students per educator during expanded learning time is really critical. The in-school thing is also really important. So we can do this in lots of ways. We can use double blocks during the school day, which is the research shows is really effective, right? Because it's really hard to get students back in buildings in after school programs or summer school programs because students really value their personal time. And so really thinking about how we can change schedules to really expand the learning day and use more time to deliver high quality content is what the research shows is really best here. So let's think about the cost. So this is a cost analysis from ERS, and they have estimated the cost of expanded learning time. And the lime green line at the top really shows the best strategies, right? And so those are the strategies that are really using many of the most effective things that you see on the left side of that chart on the last slide. And the dark blue line are expanded learning time strategies that are less effective. They're not getting students those caught up as quickly. And you'll see that expanded learning time is really costly, contrary to what folks may see. And so, in a place like Detroit, that has that $3,000 per student, they may not be able to deliver students that most effective strategy on that green line like we see here. And so it's really important to think about those costs and the most effective strategies, right? And this really underlines the point that targeted intensive tutoring is not only the most effective in giving students that most individualized tutoring that they may need, but it also may be the most cost effective as well. And the cautionary tale here, in 2012, Florida passed legislation requiring double blocks of reading in their schools, and what we really see is a vast differences in the quality. And so a study of the extra hour of reading found that relatively small increases in many of their schools, and that's because some of the schools were unable to place students with a certified teacher or in small groups. So those things really are critically important, and to think about those most effective strategies and where we are spending those critical dollars. And finally, I'm going to talk about the importance of strong relationships and connections to the adults in buildings. This is really important, as many students like Maya, who hasn't had a lot of contact with the teachers in her building, and really is feeling some kind of disconnection. It's really important that we're using evidence-based strategies to rebuild those connections or build them from scratch. And so the research shows, again, that certified teachers and staff in the building are the most important people to really rebuild those relationships, and they should be doing that in small groups so they can really get to know the students and really get to know who Maya is as a person. So teachers should know that Maya is a natural caregiver, right? And it's also really important to use that critical time to do activities around a student's goal. And it's important, again, for that certified teacher to get that pre-service and ongoing training. And now I'm going to hand it over to Allison.
Thanks, Kayla. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I'm Allison Sokol. I'm the Assistant Director of the P12 Policy Team at the Education Trust. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, and what states are required to do, and what our recommendations are for what states can do to support districts and schools in implementing in the most cost-effective way the strategies that Kayla just outlined for us. Next slide, Kayla. Great, thank you. So just a brief overview, how we got here. We've had several rounds of investment, federal funding. In March of 2020, the CARES Act provided $13.2 billion for K-12 education, and another $3 billion for governors to use on K-12 or higher ed. And then in December of 2020, at the peak of the pandemic, the Coronavirus Response and Relief and Supplemental Appropriations and Relief Act, CRSA, was passed, which is $54.3 billion on K-12 education and another $4 billion for governors. And then most recently in March of 2021, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, or what we'll call ARP, which provides $122.8 billion for K-12 education, as well as some additional funding for education, nutrition, and childcare. In sum, we're talking about a lot of money that states and districts have to support students' needs. Next slide, Kayla. So the ARP money is being distributed to states and school districts based on the Title I formula. So based on the share of Title I funding that they receive under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Under the law, states can keep up to 10% of the money they receive, and 90% has to go to eligible school districts. So we're going to be talking today about what states can be doing to support districts, because so many of the decisions that are made about how this money is spent are made at the district level, and states have a really powerful role to play in supporting district leaders in making those decisions. So what's new under ARP? There are specific set-asides that states and districts have to use on evidence-based strategies to address unfinished learning. So at a minimum, the amount that states get, they have to spend 5% of that on evidence-based strategies to address unfinished instruction, and districts have to spend 20% of the money they receive on accelerating learning. There are also set-asides for summer programs and for comprehensive after-school programs, and that money can also be used on the kinds of evidence-based strategies that Kayla was describing. We don't have time to get into in detail now, but I'll just mention that states also have to meet what's called a maintenance of effort requirement, meaning that they're spending the same on education as they did in prior fiscal years, and a maintenance of equity requirement, meaning that any cuts to the education budget cannot disproportionately affect tiny districts and schools. So how much money is your state going to get? How much of that money is going to flow to the districts in your state? So I'm going to put a link in the chat to a map that we at EdTrust have created. Pardon my typing for a second. And I'd love if we took just a few minutes, because this is a short presentation. I'm going to encourage you to go to that link, and you can scroll over your state, and it'll tell you the total amount in K-12 education relief funding that your state is getting, how much your state has to spend on statewide activities to address unfinished learning, and how much in total is going to flow to districts in your state to spend on unfinished learning. Thank you, Kayla. Yes, it's at the bottom of the page. I will remind everyone that these are floors, not ceilings. So when we're talking about these dollars, this is the minimum amount that states and districts have to spend, but they can, and in our opinion, should be thinking about other funding as well, which we'll talk about. And if you're feeling like you really want a challenge, I'll also encourage you to go to your SEA's website and see if your state has published district allocations. I think Jonathan, for example, put a link to Texas. Many, but not all states, have published estimates of the amount that each district is going to get. And so if you're curious about that, you can go to, I'll put a link here. These are all of the SEA websites there at the US Department of Ed website. You can find your state, and either now or later click around and see if your state has made public how much money specific districts are. I'm going to pause a minute and let people play around. Once you find the information, if you want to share it in the chat, I see some folks sharing state-specific resources. You can see here from the screenshot that if you live in North Carolina, for example, North Carolina is getting $5.6 billion in education relief funding. The state has about 180 million to spend on statewide activities to address unfinished learning, and school districts across North Carolina have almost $650 million to spend at a minimum. All right, Kayla, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, thanks. So just some key dates and timelines to keep in mind. States have already received at least 2/3 of their ARP money. To receive the final third, states have to submit an application to the U.S. Department of Education. The deadline was June 7th. Not all states have submitted. There are 40 states to date that have submitted their plans. And as of this morning, because a few states actually were approved just a few hours ago, 17 state plans have been approved, and those states will receive the full amount of ARP dollars. States have to allocate that money to school districts within 60 days of receiving the funds. And there are 2 district planning requirements that are helpful to keep in mind. Within 30 days of receiving the money, districts have to release a safe return to in-person instruction plan. And then within 90 days of receiving the funds, districts have to submit a plan explaining how they will use that money. And that, as we'll talk about, we hope includes how they will use that money to address unfinished learning. And the funds have to be used by September 30th, 2024. So how can the money be used? I'm going to give you the really high level answer for the sake of time, which is that it can be used extremely flexibly. Even within the set asides, there's a lot of flexibility. It can be used to address unfinished learning, to help schools prepare for physical reopening, to meet students' social emotional needs. The list is really long, and it doesn't just have to be used on short-term investments. It can be used, and we hope it will be used to make long-term systemic changes. It's important to note that there is a stakeholder engagement requirement, both for states and districts. And there's a specific list of groups that state and district leaders are required to engage in the development and implementation of the plans for spending this money. And just because we're going to send this out later as a resource, I'm not going to read through this list now. I'll just mention that there are other targeted investments, other pots of money that within ARP that states and districts have to spend. And so when you receive this as a resource later, you have this list. So what is it that we hope that states will do? Especially considering that 90% of the money is flowing directly to districts. There are 3 really key things that we hope states will do, especially to address unfinished learning that students are experiencing. The first is to issue actionable and evidence-based guidance and support to districts. Districts leaders and educators have had a really hard year too. They have to make a lot of big decisions fairly quickly with a lot of money, and guidance from the state about how to spend that money, how to think about the costs, how to think about the trade-offs, how to make decisions about the evidence based on local need. That guidance is going to be critical to ensuring that that money is spent well. The second thing is requiring districts to develop plans as required by ARP that are informed by real, meaningful stakeholder engagement with a diverse set of stakeholders, that are rooted in high quality evidence, and that are targeted to the most underserved students. And a lot of that will come down to the template or the application requirements that states do or don't create for their districts in order to receive the ARP funds. And finally, we hope that states will collect and publicly report detailed, disaggregated data that will tell stakeholders and advocates how these funds are being used and whether they're being used effectively and efficiently to accelerate student learning, especially for the most underserved students. I'll just mention, and we will share this as a resource, we've also published additional recommendations about how states can advance equity beyond just addressing unfinished learning. We don't have time to get into that today, but we'll make sure that you have that as a resource at the end of the presentation. So before I turn things back over to Kayla, I just want to mention that one of the things that comes up a lot when we're talking about these dollars is that it's a lot of money very quickly. And it's going to be really critical that states support district leaders in thinking about long-term sustainability of these funds. So just want to mention that some of the things that states can be supporting district leaders in thinking about is obviously first, what are the state and local needs, and making sure that the strategies that districts are implementing meet those needs. Planning for the full cost of implementation, which means not just buying a curriculum, but also thinking about ongoing professional development and coaching, for example, that tutors and teachers may need over time. Of course, helping district leaders think about how to invest equitably and ensuring that the strategies that they're implementing, they're taking it into consideration, not just generally what's involved, but how they'll target that money to the students and schools most in need. How to use existing funding to stretch out the impact. So ESSER dollars aren't just for new initiatives, and they're also not the only dollars that can be used to address unfinished learning. So states can be providing guidance and technical assistance to district leaders to help them think about how to leverage all of the resources they have in order to really support students. And finally, to invest these funds sustainably, we want states to be supporting districts in thinking about how their costs are going to change over time. And our partners at Education Resource Strategies have provided a lot of thinking on this, and they even have a tool that we'll share with you. Because this presentation is primarily focused on the state, we don't have time to get into it today, but it's a really incredible resource in thinking about how these funds can be used now to address students' short-term needs and in the long term to make systemic changes.
Great, so now we're gonna do an activity, and I hope you all will engage with us and engage in the chat. Whoops. Oh, first before we do the activity, I wanna talk about Kentucky's plan and what Kentucky is really doing well, and hope that you all will do the same thing with the states that you live in. So what is Kentucky doing well? From their plan, KD is using the state allotment for unfinished learning to provide building opportunities in out of school time. So these are summer learning grants to districts that operate comprehensive out of school time programming over the summer months. So they are using some of their funds to expand learning time using that ELT strategy. And so KDE is not using certified teachers for this, but they are using AmeriCorps members, which we would put in that middle category of that chart. One of the things the state is really doing well is they've provided guidance on evidence-based strategies for unfinished learning, and we're hoping other states will do the same, including for targeted intensive tutoring and summer programs. So we've already done the work here. So if anyone's from Kentucky, maybe you will just take a deeper look in your state. But what's missing from Kentucky's plan is that they have a limited role in determining how local funds are used, they say, in the plan. So they really haven't included a template for districts to use when applying for ARP funds. And we're really hoping that states will take a more critical leadership role in helping districts to make sure that they're spending those critical dollars in the ways that they should be. And so we will, for this activity, want you to do something very similar to what we've just done here. We want you to spend a few minutes of quiet time analyzing your state's plan, and I think Allison is going to put the link in the chat for you all. And so if your state hasn't submitted a plan yet, please review another state during this time. So what we want you to do is, based off of some of the things that we talked about today and based off the charts and the unfinished learning briefs, answer these questions. And you definitely won't have time to get through all of these questions, but we're hoping that you'll pick a couple to take a deep look at. So what we are hoping you'll do is think about, does your state's approach to addressing unfinished learning seem sufficient given the amount of money they're receiving? That's one question. The second question is, has the state obligated specific dollar amount for one of the evidence-based strategies that we talked about today? And also, what is missing from your estate plan? Kentucky is a good example. So what you'll see is many of the plans are probably thin and they really haven't fleshed out a lot of things. And the final question is, what, if anything, is the state doing to ensure equity and these dollars are being spent equitably? So I'm gonna give you all folks a few minutes to dig through your state's plan and see if you can find an answer to any of these questions. Please use the chat. Once you find the answer, please chat it to us or to everyone. I think we're going to give you guys 6 more minutes to see if you can find at least one of the answers to these questions. I see some folks are already sharing. We have about 3 more minutes for this activity. All right, so from the chat, it sounds like you all are finding some interesting things. And I think this last chat that we just got from Sabrina really highlights what we were noticing as well, is that many of the plans are very vague. And so that's a really good moment for folks like us to really push to make sure that states are giving some kind of guidance and really making sure that we're coloring in some of the things that they left vague in the plan. So this is a really important window of opportunity. So while many states are, or some, I guess 17 states have already had their plans approved, I just realized I am not on video. That's not helpful. So while many states have had their plans approved, there's a lot more that we can do, as I just mentioned. And so what we are hoping folks like us will do is take a look at the plans and ask states to issue detailed guidance if some of the plans are really vague and we haven't really identified whether or not that they are making sure they're spending that money on some of the unfinished learning strategies that we talked about today, and making sure that they're doing it in the most effective way. So what some of you guys talked about in the chat is like a lot of these plans are very high level. It's one thing that we can do is just ask for more information, ask if there's any more detail in those plans that weren't in the federal application. If they have some other plans in the works, it's really important that we engage with states, especially because there's a federal requirement for them to engage with the community around these plans. And finally, we should urge states to collect and report info about how money is being spent. We are taking a look at some states now, and we have seen very few states actually report or plan to report how they're going to spend that money. And so we really think that that should be transparent, and folks should be able to see those numbers online. And at the end of this presentation, which all of you will receive, there are links to many of the things that Allison thought she was putting in the chat. I think some of you all did get some of them, but there are a lot of resources on our website. You can go to or you can Google, which is quickest thing. You can Google unfinished learning and trust strategies. And that is the end of our presentation, but we're happy to take questions. If folks have questions, they can just type them in the chat or in the Q&A.
I'll just mention that as folks are continuing to dig into their state's plan, or if your state's plan has not been approved yet and you're still waiting to find out what they're going to say, we'll make sure to provide our contact information after the presentation. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions you have about what you're reading. Is this good? What questions should I be asking for more details? This is a real window of opportunity that I know we're all eager to take advantage of.
There was a question in here, Allison. Any ideas about unmet needs that federal funding won't cover and that private-public partnerships might help to support? I think in our 5 things states can do seed brief, we talked a lot about building relationships with community organizations, right? And so community organizations have a unique opportunity to really help to meet the social, emotional, and academic needs of our students. One thing that we are really flagging in terms of equity is making sure that those organizations have some kind of track record of doing this type of work. There's lots of people who are just popping up with brand new organizations. We really want to make sure that folks are using evidence-based strategies and they have been around some time, so we know that they are using the most effective strategies. Very good question.
I have a question about whether there are any exemplar states that are transparently showing how they're spending funds. None to date. We're still digging into state plans and are hoping in the coming weeks to be able to lift up some promising practices we're seeing. I'll say the plans for reporting, I think, are lagging a little bit behind. The U.S. Department of Education has a window right now where folks can provide comments on their potential guidance around what states will be required to report. And we're hoping to see some states really dig in and provide detailed information on where those dollars are flowing, but no promising practices to share today.
And we can type answers to the questions in the Q&A.
To Stephanie's question, yes, there's a formal public comment period. And now that I know how to send chats and links to everybody, I will put the information here for those of you who are interested.
All right, folks, Allison and I are still going to be around so we can answer the questions in the Q&A. You can also ask any questions as they come to you in the Q&A, and I'm sure one of us will be available to answer them. That is the end of our presentation. We're going to start the next session soon. Thank you so much for engaging in the chat and taking a look at your plans. It was really helpful. And we're around as always. You can find Allison and I on the website. You can go to edtrust.org and click the staff link, and we are available to answer questions. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.